Urgent question, Philp.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To ask the Home Secretary if she will make a statement on the government's extremism review reported this morning.
Minister Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In our manifesto, the government set out our commitment to redoubling efforts to counter extremism, including online, to stop people being radicalised and drawn towards hateful ideologies. A number of strands of activity have been established to progress this work, which, amongst other things, have led to the appointment of an interim Prevent Commissioner, Lord Anderson, to drive forward improvements, and we've published plans to introduce youth diversion orders to tackle young people at risk of terrorism. Now, Mr Speaker, many documents are produced across government as part of commissioned work, which are not implemented and which do not constitute government policy. This work did not recommend an expansion in the definition of extremism, and there are not and have never been any plans to do so. To be clear, the leaked documents were not current or new government policy. As we have said repeatedly, Islamist extremism, followed by far-right extremism, are the biggest threats that we face. The Home Secretary set out last week our plans to carry out an end-to-end review of prevent thresholds on Islamist extremism because we are concerned that referrals are too low. And ideology, particularly Islamist extremism, followed by far-right extremism, continue to be at the heart of our approach to countering extremism and countering terrorism. But as the horrific Southport attack shows, we also need more action on those drawn towards mixed ideologies and violence-obsessed young people. As the Home Secretary set out in the House last week, there have been a troubling rise in the number of cases involving teenagers drawn into extremism, including Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, mixed and confused ideology, and obsession with violence. This includes a threefold increase in under-18s investigated for involvement in terrorism, and some 162 people were referred to Prevent last year for concerns relating to school massacres. And our Five Eyes counter-terror partners have also warned about growing radicalisation of teenagers and young people. Mr Speaker, we will continue to drive forward work to counter the most significant extremist threats in the weeks and months ahead, as the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have already set out.
Shadow Home Secretary Philp.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday evening, Policy Exchange put into the public domain the Home Secretary's review into extremism, or at least a version of it. It did contain some deeply concerning proposals that I would like the Minister to directly address. The report apparently says that the definition of extremism for the purposes of the Prevent and other programmes could be extended to include the spreading of misinformation, the online so-called manosphere and misogyny. So firstly, does the Minister agree with Prevent reviewer William Shawcross that we need to focus the attention of Prevent and counter-terrorism policing on those with extremist ideologies and not risk diluting attention with these much wider issues? 94% of terrorism-caused deaths since 1999 were caused by Islamist terrorism. Does he agree that combating Islamist terrorism is more important than policing the manosphere? Now, the wider issues referenced, such as violence against women and girls and more general violence obsession, are of course serious, but they are best dealt with by the police, the criminal justice system, social services or mental health services, who of course have the power to section people that pose a risk. Secondly, will the Minister commit to retaining the changes to non-crime hate incidents made by the last government? Police should not be looking into matters or recording personal data where there is no imminent risk of criminality. To do so would waste police time and infringe freedom of speech. Any move away from this will enable the thought police to stop anyone telling uncomfortable truths that left-wing lawyers don't like. Finally, the report the Home Secretary commissioned repeats the Prime Minister's previous smear that campaigning against rape gangs, who we now know are of predominantly Pakistani heritage perpetrators, is far right. And the report also says that commenting on elements of policing policy is extremist and far right. That is nonsense. Campaigning against rape gangs is not extremist or far right, and commenting on policing, whether you agree or not with the comments, is simply the exercise of free speech. So will the Minister categorically disown those remarks which were contained in the Home Secretary's report?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me just gently remind the Shadow Home Secretary that his remarks refer to a leaked report, which, as I could not have been clearer about, does not and will not represent government policy. The work, as I understand it, because it's not entirely clear which version of a report was actually leaked, but as I understand it, the work did not recommend an expansion in the definition of extremism. And as I said to the House earlier, there are not, nor will there be, any plans to do so. Now, Shadow Home Secretary mentioned William Shawcross, and let me again just gently remind him that this government have implemented all but one of the recommendations in the Shawcross review. The Shadow Home Secretary also asked me about non-hate crime incidents. Now, again, the Home Secretary has been very clear about this, that a consistent and common sense approach must be taken with regard to non-crime hate incidents. The government has also been, again, crystal clear that our top priority for policing is to deliver on the Safer Streets mission to rebuild neighbourhood policing, restore public confidence and make progress on the ambition to halve knife crime and violence against women and girls.
Clive Efford.
Mr Speaker, I've got to be careful here, Mr Speaker, because I think you are right to issue this urgent question. But can the Minister respond to me and explain just exactly why we're here? Because it seems to be that we...
Well, I think I can answer that. Because I've decided we don't need to pursue it any further. Clive Efford.
Yeah, because the Shadow Home Secretary seems to have come here to ask questions about a document that is not government policy and stand there and make indignant statements about issues that are not government policy either. Don't you think that we should be taking a much more level-headed approach to this issue that's being displayed by the party opposite?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his observations, which I entirely agree with. This government is always, and ministers in this government are always very happy to come to this place to discuss and debate government policy. But the leaked report is not government policy.
Lisa Smart, the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. There is no place for extremism or hatred of any form in our society. And it's right that the government works with communities to stamp this out, not least after the previous Conservative government seemed to seek out opportunities to sow more and more seeds of division. From what we've heard about the Extremism Review report, it doesn't bring the right answers forwards and it risks being counterproductive. So now it's up to the government to develop a counter-extremism strategy that is strong, effective and alive to the modern challenges our society is facing. And that includes addressing the increasingly complex online world and its role in inciting extremism. I would welcome more details from the Minister on how the government will do this. To be effective, this work must also properly engage communities. Will the Minister set out how communities will be consulted on any upcoming counter-extremism strategies?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for her questions, which are entirely sensible and reasonable. She's absolutely right to say that there is no place for extremism in our society, and this government will use all of those levers available to us to ensure that we work across party, across government, to ensure that we have got the right resources in the right place to tackle what is an increasingly challenging threat. She's right that an important element of tackling this threat is the work that we need to do and are doing with regard to the online space. She will be aware that the Online Safety Act will soon be formally brought into it will come into power and into force. And we've said consistently that we will look very closely at how effective that will be, and where we need to make changes, of course, we will do so. The conversations, as she will imagine, continue with the social media companies. We expect them to do the right thing. We expect that where there is illegal content online, that it is removed, and removed at pace. But she's also right to stress the importance of working with communities. And that's why the work that we seek to do in terms of countering extremism is done properly across government, with MHCLG being a key partner.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his unambiguous statement? I had a feeling he was going to say something along those lines, because I read a similar unambiguous statement from the Home Office in this morning's newspapers, so I don't understand how the Shadow Home Secretary has struggled to follow the Government's position. Does the Minister agree with me that the correct way to deal with extremism is to focus on what drives it, in particular access to weaponry and knives, which, as we saw in the Southport attack last week, have a devastating effect, but have devastating effects across the country? What steps is the Home Office taking to restrict access to knives and weaponry for those with extreme views?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I think he does raise a very important point. And over the weekend, the Home Secretary announced stricter age verification checks and a ban on doorstep drops to protect people from knife crime. These measures are set to be included as part of the Crime and Policing Bill, which is expected to be introduced to Parliament by the spring. And under these new rules, a two-step system will be mandated for all retailers selling knives online, requiring customers to submit photo ID at the point of sale and again on delivery. Delivery companies will only be able to deliver a bladed article to the person who purchased it, and it will also be illegal to leave a package containing a bladed weapon on a doorstep when no one is in to receive it.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the early years of Margaret Thatcher's government, Lord Scarman was commissioned to write a report on what was, and they didn't use the phrase at the time, but basically concerns amongst the black community about two-tier policing. In response to those concerns, the police listened, they changed their procedures, they engaged in consultative work with those communities. So why is it, under his government, when communities complain about two-tier policing, they are branded as far-right extremists?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman, as a former Home Secretary, will have worked throughout his time, not just in that particular great office of state, but elsewhere with our police force. And I hope very much that he shares the admiration and respect that I'm answering the question. I hope that he very much shares the admiration and the respect that we on these benches have for the incredibly difficult and challenging work that the police do. I have to say to him that those who seek to progress a narrative of two-tier policing do our police forces no favours whatsoever. All they seek to do is make it more difficult for those extraordinary men and women who step forward to serve in our police force to do a very, very important job.
Joe White.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In all the commentary overnight on this leaked advice, I was very struck by one comment from the Shadow Justice Secretary reported on GB News. He said, and I quote, that of course violence against women and girls and some of the other issues raised in this report warrant attention by the police. Warrant attention, Mr. Speaker? Warrant attention? Is it any wonder that sexual violence was allowed to become endemic under the previous government? And all the best a previous Home Secretary can say is warrant attention.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Shadow Justice Minister was a Home Office Minister for a considerable period of time, and perhaps he might be worthwhile to reflect on the record of his government while he was a minister.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this report that has just been leaked was commissioned by the Home Secretary after the Southport horrors last July. And the truth is that it's come out and all of the recommendations have immediately been basically written off by the Home Secretary. Doesn't that confirm that people in her department are completely out of touch with the wishes of the Home Secretary and the British people?
Minister.
Thank you. Not at all. The honourable member is simply not correct. This is work that was being progressed before the dreadful incident in Southport. As I'm sure, and certainly I hope, that the honourable member will appreciate that in government, Secretaries of State will routinely commission advice from civil servants. Some of the recommendations of that advice will be accepted and agreed, some will not. But it is routine practice in government to ask civil servants to look very closely at particular issues, but ultimately it's for ministers to decide, and ministers will decide.
Oliver Ryan.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as interesting as it sounds, I have no idea what a manosphere is. But as far as I'm concerned, the only real question that the Security Minister needs to answer today is what action the government is taking to ensure that this kind of disgraceful, politically motivated leak to a former Tory adviser cannot happen again, especially on issues of national security. We proudly have an impartial civil service. So, will he ask the Cabinet Secretary to order an immediate leak inquiry? And will he also ask him to put on gardening leave those Tory advisers and civil servants who are still working in Downing Street and those who are regarded as close associates of Andrew Gilligan? Thank you.
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his helpful point. I mean, it is standard procedure in circumstances such as this that the Cabinet Secretary will order a leak inquiry, and that would be the right way to proceed under these circumstances.
A bit more.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Keighley, we have seen how labelling legitimate concerns around grooming gangs as far right has distorted conversations, silenced victims, and inadvertently given space to bad faith actors. It is therefore incredibly concerning to see this report, written by officials in the Home Office, using similar language, calling grooming gangs as alleged problem, and once again framing this issue through the eyes and the lenses of the far right rather than through the eyes of victims. So does the Minister agree with the language used in this report around grooming gangs? And if not, how can he, or indeed the Home Secretary, have faith in the Home Office officials?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am grateful to the honourable member, and he's been consistent in raising his concerns in this particular area. I hope that he will understand that I was very clear earlier on that many documents are produced across government as part of commission work which aren't implemented, do not constitute government policy. This is, to be absolutely clear with him, this work did not, this is a leaked document, but this work did not recommend an expansion in the definition of extremism. These are not government plans. This is not government policy.
Mike Tutt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the party opposite now considers it okay for public servants to leak documents relating to national security, then I hope they will not object if we now see leaks on matters relating to their time in charge, such as the risks arising from Russian donors to the Tory party and our great country. Whatever happened to British values, Mr. Speaker? Does the Security Minister agree with me?
Your voice has continued, even though I don't see as much of you these days. Right up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not surprised they're wound up by that. Does the Security Minister agree with me that at least one party in this House needs to behave within our values when it comes to security and state that security leaks are wrong?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable member. All leaks are wrong. But let me just take this opportunity to say I'm actually very proud of the civil servants who work in the Home Office, day in, day out, working extremely hard to keep our country safe from a diverse range of threats. There are a number of members opposite who have worked in the Home Office, and I hope very much that they share my view that we should be extremely grateful to those civil servants who work around the clock to keep our country safe, and I am grateful for their efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The horrendous events in Southport show that people who don't fit the profile of Islamist or far-right extremism can still present serious risk. Would the Minister agree that there is a very real danger in the promotion of misogyny and opposition to feminism online, and that to combat the scourge of violence against women and girls, which sees one woman murdered almost every 3 days in the UK, the government must take misogyny seriously as a form of extremism?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady. I think she makes an incredibly important point, and hopefully she will know and understand how seriously this government takes these issues. We've made a very ambitious manifesto commitment to halve violence against women and girls over 10 years. That is something that, as ministers in the Home Office with the Home Secretary and the Safeguarding Minister, we are working at pace to address. We take these matters very seriously, and she's absolutely right to identify the particular challenges that exist online. And the Safeguarding Minister will have more to say about this in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Security Minister for his words today, and he's successfully exposed the reports about this leak as the nonsense that they are. But there are serious issues here, including around how we respond to the rising level of youth violence and extremism, and the increasing availability of online material, which is fueling that obsession with violence and death. Can the Security Minister tell us how the intelligence services are approaching this challenge, and what more the government can do to stop young people disappearing into this dangerous abyss?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady does raise a very important point, and the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have both referred to this recently, including during their statements on the 21st of February. She's right. There have been a troubling rise in the number of cases involving young men, boys, teenagers, who are being drawn into extremism. Now, as I said to the House earlier, this includes a range of different areas, both Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, but also there is a particularly concerning rise in those drawn into what's referred to as mixed and confused ideology, and those young men, boys, who have an obsession with violence. This is not a threat that is unique to the United Kingdom. This is a threat that is being experienced internationally, but I can give her an assurance that both the intelligence services and our law enforcement partners are working with government at pace, along with our international partners, to look at what more we can do in this particular area.
Sir Bernard.
Mr. Speaker, can I first echo the Minister's point that we should be grateful to those civil servants who are working night and day to protect us from terrorist threats. And I suppose we should also be grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for denouncing the document that certainly emanated from his department without making any personal criticism of those civil servants. But doesn't that document demonstrate that there's a large body of opinion that has completely lost its way in terms of how we deal with extremism and terrorist threats? And could I urge him to encourage the department to return to what Prevent is really intended to achieve, and not get distracted by all this political correctness, given that most of the country have no idea what a non-hate crime incident is. We need to return to proper language that people understand, or indeed the government itself is driving the disillusion and despair that people have about these matters.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful, as I always am, to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his observations, and I'm grateful as well for the point that he made about civil servants. He talks about political correctness. I hope that he knows the Home Secretary and myself well, having served together in this House over many years, that fundamentally it has to be about the threat. And we will leave no stone unturned to ensure that we have the appropriate level of resource in the right place at the right time to ensure that the ever-evolving and complex nature of the threat that we face both in the United Kingdom but also abroad as well is appropriately addressed by our law enforcement agencies. I give him a categorical assurance that we will continue to work around the clock to make sure that we protect the public.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Security Minister for clarifying the timeline of when this report was commissioned. But of course we should remember that since that report was commissioned, we've seen the brutal, sadistic murders in Southport and the riots that came after it. Clearly we are living in a time of rising and worrying extremism, and that should concern us on all sides of this House. Therefore, does the Security Minister agree with me that those on all sides of this House should be working together to deal with extremism rather than playing political games?
Minister.
I think the honourable member does make a very important point, and I hope the House will know that it is always my default setting, if you want to put it in that way, to try and work collaboratively with members right across this House. I give the honourable member and I give the House an absolute assurance of the seriousness with which we take these particular matters. I think members will understand that it is right to commission civil servants to look very carefully at the profound nature of the threat that we face and bring forward policy suggestions and solutions to how we as a government are best placed to address them. That is what is happening, but this government will always do the right thing to ensure that we protect the public.
Pete Wishaw.
Mr. Speaker, I think we have to tread very carefully when we enter into this territory, and the leak of this report has already raised alarm bells with a number of different groups. It has also given the right another opportunity to spread division and further disinformation. So what reassurances can he give campaign groups, environmentalists and those that are taking up campaigns that they will not be included when he finally brings forward his plans in the future?
Minister.
Thank you. I'm happy to give the honourable gentleman assurance that this government will always approach these matters in a level-headed and consensual way. I have to say that it is the case that previous governments sought to use these particular issues as a political football. Well, it is the case that previous governments were on occasion motivated as much by a desire to score political points. And that will never be the approach of this government. We're only motivated by a desire to protect the public.
The Barnsley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to echo the concerns raised by my honourable member from Edinburgh East and Musselburgh. Because in my own constituency just this weekend we had an incident in our community with young people and knives. And whilst I cannot comment on this particular incident, I am, Mr. Speaker, extremely concerned about the availability of knives, particularly to our young people. So, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree with me that the sale of knives, particularly online, is too easy? And, Mr. Speaker, can he tell me and my constituents what the government are doing to restrict this availability and the fear that goes into our communities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government shares the honourable lady's concern about the availability of knives online. And that's why, as I said to another honourable member just a moment ago, just this weekend the Home Secretary has announced stricter age verification checks and a ban on doorstep drops to greater protect people from knife crime. We will do everything that we possibly can, working with online retailers and the police, to ensure that the availability of knives is very, very significantly reduced in order to protect the public.
Sir Desmond Swade.
The repudiation of the contents is a step back from thought crime. The danger remains of 2 steps toward it. Isn't it outrageous when individuals are harassed by the police when they haven't broken the law?
Yeah. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the right honourable gentleman is right in the sense that, of course, the police should and will be guided by the law. He, as an experienced member, will, I am sure, have worked very closely with the police over many, many years. My experience of working closely with the police is that they make the right judgments for the right reasons. But where there are issues that require further attention, then, of course, the government will look at these matters.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems that advice to ministers on national security issues has been leaked to a former Tory special advisor, and as a result of that leak, the Security Minister has been summoned here to answer questions, even though the leak does not represent government policy, and the Minister has made clear that the advice has been rejected. Does he agree with me that this sets a dangerous precedent and may encourage more disgruntled individuals to commit politically motivated leaks, and that this shows that His Majesty's official opposition is sadly sinking into the mire of populism, which can only undermine our national security and indeed our democracy in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as I hope that I have made crystal clear, I am always happy to come to this House to debate and discuss matters relating to national security. I will do that whenever the House wishes me to do so. But on this particular occasion, and as I think I have been crystal clear, this is a leak about something which does not represent government policy.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no place for extremism in our society or country from anyone. Prevent unfairly associate certain ethnic minorities and religious groups with extremism. Also, the programme's vague definition of extremism has led to an inconsistent implementation with concerns about overreach. What steps is the government taking to address the discrimination and failings in the Prevent programme to make it impartial and effective to prevent extremism and violence from across all of society?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the honourable member is right to say that there is no place for extremism in this country. Of course, that is the case. But I have to say I don't agree with his characterisation of the Prevent programme. The Prevent programme consists of some extremely dedicated and hard-working public servants, but he will know that the Home Secretary has announced the appointment of an interim Prevent Commissioner, Lord Anderson, and Lord Anderson will be looking very closely at how the Prevent programme works and how it can be made to work more effectively in the future.
Mark Blitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When tackling extremism, whether violent or non-violent, is the Security Minister satisfied that the current division of labour between counter-terrorism policing and the security service is understood well enough by those two organisations and is delivering and working well?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always very grateful to the right honourable member, and I know that he speaks with real experience and authority on these matters, and I think he raises an important and reasonable question. Yes, I am happy to give him that assurance. I work incredibly closely both with counter-terrorism police and with operational partners on a daily basis. Of course, we look at these things very closely and keep them under review, and if we think that we need to change the balance in any particular area, then we won't hesitate to do so.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Security Minister thinks there's not two-tier policing in this country, then quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, he needs to get out more. Because this report actually states that anybody who calls out two-tier policing is a far-right extremist, and grooming rape gangs are an alleged problem. Does the Minister agree?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The point I was seeking to make earlier on, and I'm happy to reiterate to the honourable member, is about the importance that we on this side attach to supporting the police. We think that the police do an incredibly difficult job, and whilst he might think that I need to get out a bit more, well, perhaps the honourable member might like to consider spending a bit of time with police officers on the beat in his constituency, in his area. If he were to do so, I'm quite confident that he would see that they are exceptional people doing difficult work under difficult circumstances, and there is a real risk that by seeking to progress this narrative, it undermines the important work of the police.
Andrew Morrison, Dr. Grant.
Speaker, thank you. It's good to see the Minister at the dispatch box to distance himself from the conclusions of a report commissioned by his department. But reports don't leak themselves. Why does he think whoever leaked this does not agree with the Minister that there's nothing to see here?
Minister.
Ultimately, that is, of course, a matter for the leaker. But as I have already said, it is standard procedure in circumstances such as this for the Cabinet Office to initiate a leak inquiry. I think that that would be the right course of action under these circumstances. So If I were the leaker, I wouldn't be too comfortable at the moment.
Jeremy Corbett.
Mr. Speaker, obviously in drawing up a policy, the Minister needs to consult with the representatives of all communities, particularly those that are suffering the worst attacks by the far right in Britain at the present time. Could he assure us that he will be meeting the Muslim Council of Britain and he will be meeting other Muslim organisations in drawing up this policy, and that the statements made by his office that there were no plans to change the non-cooperation with the MCB has now been brought to an end?
Minister.
I respond to the right honourable gentleman in this way, that he is right. That government has an absolute responsibility to consult with all communities. Of course, that is work that is shared across government, and that is why we work very closely with other government departments, not least the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, who are progressing their own bits of work with regard to all of this. With regard to the specific point he made about liaison, there isn't a change to the government policy specifically with regard to that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister explain why the review appears to focus on the symptoms of extremism rather than the underlying root causes of extremism? And can he assure the House that this mindset is not directing policy in the Home Office?
Minister.
I can assure him that the mindset that directs policy in the Home Office is what the Home Secretary and I think is in our national interest. And the Home Secretary and I will use every tool, every lever at our disposal to make sure that we keep the public safe. That is what we get out of bed every morning to do, and that is what we will continue to do.
Jim Allister.
Thank you. I trust the Minister will agree that terrorism in all its forms is always deserving only of punishment and repudiation, and never of glorification, particularly by political leaders. Does the Minister therefore agree that it's beyond reprehensible that the First Minister of Northern Ireland, Michelle O'Neill, continues to attend IRA celebrations of the actions of IRA terrorists, no later than just before Christmas, when she laid a wreath and spoke at the commemoration for 3 IRA terrorists who blew themselves up with their own bomb? What message does that send on extremism to future generations?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that he will understand that I don't think in the context of this particular response it would be appropriate for me to delve into particular matters in Northern Ireland. But let me make a point of consensus that his remarks at the beginning of his question about there never being any excuse or any justification for terrorism is one around which we can all unite.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Security Minister recently told me that it remains government policy not to engage with the Muslim Council of Britain. Last week, the Minister for Social Security and Disability attended the MCB annual leadership dinner. Did that minister breach government policy, or is engagement with the MCB now tolerated after all?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable member. He asked me a question previously at Home Office orals, specifically in the context of engagement by the Home Secretary and her ministers. In fact, the Shadow Home Secretary is kind of chuntering from a sedentary position. He literally showed me the Hansard transcript before this urgent question. So if the honourable gentleman will allow me, I'll respond to his question. He asked me previously about engagement with the Home Secretary and ministers. With regard to other ministers, clearly I can't from the dispatch box account for other ministers' activities, but I'm happy to look at the circumstances that he's raised. I'm happy to confirm to him that government policy has not changed, and if there are specific points that we need to come back to him with, I'm very happy to do so.
Dr. Fadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Extreme misogyny associated with far-right ideology is a major factor in extremism and should be dealt with to counteract it. In order to keep the 1 in 3 women that are being killed in our country, in order to ensure that the horrendous killing of the Southport killers does not happen again, also for the Jake Davison who killed 5 in Plymouth and the 51 massacred in Christchurch, New Zealand. No one wants violence, ideological or political. Does the Minister agree with me that our obsession and focusing solely on Islamism has left repeated governments blindsided to real threats facing us from elsewhere?
Well, he's right to say that extreme misogyny is frankly, is a disgusting blight on our country, and that is why this government has made a manifesto commitment to halve the levels of violence against women and girls. It is an ambitious commitment that has not been made previously. As I said to the House earlier on, the Home Secretary and the Safeguarding Minister are working at pace to seek to address these kind of issues. It is a big priority for the government, and we intend to make good on the commitments that we have made.
Jim Sharp. Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for his answers, and in particular I welcome the Minister's commitment to supporting the police, as he's said a few times. I do have grave concerns that the revival of the non-crime hate incidents will mean more work for our overstretched police forces and to get involved in a war of offensive words rather than the war against drugs, the war against extremism, or the war against violence on women and children. So can the Minister indicate if the revival of these non-crime hate incidents will come with a substantial increase in police funding, and where will that come from? Thank you.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful, as I always am, to the honourable member, and very grateful for the support that I know that he's provided to the police over many years. Let me seek to reassure him, because the Home Secretary has been clear that a consistent and common sense approach must be taken with regard to non-crime hate incidents. The government has also been, again, crystal clear that our top priority for policing is delivering on our Safer Streets mission.
Completes the question. We'll let the front benches change over.